billionaire CEO took his mistress to a 7-star hotel at night, only to discover his wife owned it. The private lift hummed quietly, a discreet vibration beneath polished marble. Calder Whitlock had just leaned toward Felicity, tracing the soft curve of a smile, when the moment fractured. "My beautiful family, welcome back to Mr. Williams' story time. May the Almighty cover you with endless mercy, bless your homes with peace, and crown your hearts with strength that never fades. May He grant every woman dignity that cannot be shaken, every man wisdom that inspires, and every child joy that lights the world. May sorrow never hold you, and may your days shine brighter than the stars. I pray for your health, your success, and your family's happiness, that your steps lead only to blessings and your nights bring you calm." The door to Suite 71B, a door that had always symbolized exclusivity, secrecy, and his careful control, shifted. A hand drew the curtain aside, and in the frame appeared Seraphine. Calm, measured, present, Felicity froze, her poised confidence faltering for the briefest instant. Calder's own composure wavered, disbelief and calculation colliding in his eyes. The room, meticulously arranged for intimacy, now felt suddenly exposed, a stage with a spotlight he had never intended. The sound of the city outside, normally a distant pulse, seemed to fade as the weight of her presence filled every corner. Seraphine's gaze did not falter. She scanned the space with a precision that was more than observation. It was acknowledgement of every nuance Calder had so carefully constructed. In a single instant, the control he assumed he possessed evaporated, leaving only a quiet, undeniable confrontation. The air between them thickened without a word being spoken. It was not hostility or rage that marked her entrance, but the quiet inevitability of presence, the subtle claim of ownership that went beyond paper or title. Calder, usually the master of outcomes, felt the sharp edge of unpreparedness. Felicity, elegant and composed as she was, recognized the gravity immediately. The private world she thought she inhabited had been intersected by another force entirely. Calder's mind raced, cataloging possibilities he had never anticipated. The suite, designed for discretion, now held a tension that no amount of planning could dissolve. He sensed that tonight, the architecture of his control had shifted, subtly, imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. Felicity's hand rested lightly on the arm of the chair, a gesture meant to anchor her poise, but even she could not ignore the undercurrent that had seeped into the room. Seraphine's presence suggested knowledge and authority far beyond what Calder had imagined she would ever assert in such a space. The moment lingered, fragile and unpredictable. It whispered a truth neither of the two could yet grasp fully. Some intersections, once they occur, cannot be undone, and some revelations arrive not with clamor, but with quiet precision. Calder's carefully orchestrated evening, built on assumptions, indulgences, and a sense of invulnerability, had become the stage for an unspoken revelation whose magnitude he could only sense, not yet measure. Outside, the city continued its endless hum, indifferent to the seismic shift in the suite. The night had promised intimacy, luxury, and discretion. Instead, it offered a glimpse of forces at play Calder had never accounted for. The consequences, still veiled, hung in the space like suspended crystal, glittering, fragile, and dangerously beautiful. As we step into this tale of wealth, intrigue, and quiet confrontations, remember that every detail, the tilt of a glance, the soft click of a door, the shift in tension, carries meaning. This story, like so many in our city, is layered and complex, inviting you to feel the stakes, sense the tension, and immerse yourself fully in the experience. Your engagement keeps these narratives alive, and I want to express gratitude for your curiosity, your patience, and your attention. It's the first step in a journey that promises surprises, revelations, and moments you won't forget. Before we step deeper into the night's unfolding story, I'd like to ask you to pause for a brief moment. If you're drawn in by what you've heard so far, give this video a like. It helps this story reach others who love cinematic tales of power, emotion, and consequence. And if you enjoy stories that take you behind closed doors, where choices carry weight and truth can shift everything, then make sure to subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime. Every week, we explore narratives that remind us how life's most defining moments often arrive quietly, in whispers, in glances, and sometimes in rooms like this one, where every heartbeat changes direction. Tell me in the comments, what do you think Seraphine's next move will be? Does she walk away or does she take control? Your thoughts shape how this community grows, one story at a time. Now, let's return to Suite 71B, where silence speaks louder than words. The suite itself seemed to breathe with anticipation. Soft light pooled against the polished surfaces, highlighting textures that spoke of meticulous craftsmanship and quiet extravagance. Every object, from the crystal decanter on the sideboard to the subtle pattern of the silk curtains, suggested intent, a world arranged not for display, but for precision and discretion. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside Suite 71B, time followed a different rhythm. The faint click of heels in distant corridors, the whisper of air moving through vents, the gentle alignment of objects on a table, all carried weight. This was a sanctuary, a playground, a carefully curated stage where power, desire, and secrecy intersected. Yet beneath the veneer of perfection, a tension threaded through the room. It was unspoken, almost imperceptible, but it clung to every shadow, every glance, every movement. Calder, usually the orchestrator of outcomes, felt it tugging at the edges of his control. Felicity sensed it too, a delicate imbalance that had arrived without warning, and Seraphine, standing at the doorway, embodied it entirely, the quiet claim of authority, the subtle shift that suggested the night would end differently than either of the others expected. In this suite of luxury and restraint, the first pulse of a story had begun, one that would carry secrets, desires, and revelations through the hours ahead. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the audience, you, were now witnessing the first tremors of a night that promised to change everything. The city pulsed beneath the night sky, its streets alive with motion and light. Towers of steel and glass caught the glow of street lamps, their reflections stretching like liquid fire across the avenues below. The hum of traffic wove through the blocks, steady and insistent, while faint echoes of laughter and music drifted from cafes, galleries, and restaurants tucked into side streets. Above it all, the skyline reached upward, a complex grid of ambition and ingenuity, windows glowing with the private endeavors of countless lives. Each light hinted at hidden conversations, whispered decisions, and moments of connection. The city seemed to move in a rhythm of its own making, neither stopping nor waiting, offering endless possibilities to those who navigated it with purpose. Even in the quieter neighborhoods, life continued with an understated energy. Pedestrians moved with intent, blending urgency and leisure, while the scent of rain and warm asphalt mingled with the faint aroma of coffee and night-blooming flowers. Every corner held potential, opportunities, encounters, and surprises that could shift the course of any story unfolding within its boundaries. The metropolis was a living entity, shimmering and unpredictable, a stage where fortunes could rise and fall, and where ambitions could collide with consequences in ways both subtle and profound. Tonight, its lights reflected the beginning of a story that would trace the intersections of wealth, desire, and unexpected revelations. Calder Whitlock moved through the city with the effortless authority of a man accustomed to being the center of both attention and consequence. His presence carried weight, not loud or forced, but undeniable, the kind that drew glances and set conversations into silent adjustment. His tailored suit fit with exacting precision, the subtle sheen of its fabric catching the glow of streetlights as he walked with deliberate purpose. As the CEO of Whitlock Capital, Calder's reputation extended far beyond corporate halls. His strategic acumen had turned nascent ventures into industry dominions, and his instincts in negotiation were studied by peers and competitors alike. He had learned long ago that influence was less about volume and more about the quiet articulation of presence. the subtle insistence that the world adapt to his terms. Yet power alone did not define him. Calder's charm carried into every encounter, business or private, allowing him to command intimacy with the same finesse he wielded in the boardroom. He was magnetic, dangerous in his capacity to captivate, and skilled in assessing the desires and boundaries of others. Relationships, indulgences, and the pursuit of pleasure were navigated as carefully as his investments, measured, strategic, and unapologetically precise. Within Calder existed a duality, a man of extreme influence in public and a man of cultivated appetites in private. Few could fully meet him without recognizing the subtle pressure of a life so practiced, so carefully arranged, that every gesture suggested mastery over the world and over the heartbeats of those who crossed his path. Felicity Harrow moved through the city with a deliberate grace that suggested both confidence and calculation. Every step, every subtle tilt of her head, conveyed someone who had learned the art of observation and the power of presence. She was not defined by youth or fleeting beauty. She was shaped by experience, molded through years of navigating social landscapes where influence and desire often intersected with ambition. Her eyes carried a quiet intelligence, noting the smallest details in a room, reading intentions before they were spoken. Felicity's allure was neither accidental nor performative. It was intentional, cultivated over time to command attention, negotiate opportunity, and assert agency in spaces designed to test composure. She understood the balance between charm and restraint, knowing precisely when to step forward and when to hold back, when to speak and when to let silence speak. With Calder, her presence was electric yet measured. She had learned the contours of his desires, the patterns of his indulgences, and the subtle gaps in his defenses. Their connection was a delicate equation, intimacy governed by experience, allure balanced with strategy, and a mutual understanding that both were players in a game that demanded precision. Felicity's strength lay not only in her elegance, but in her command of perception. She could be captivating without being vulnerable, persuasive without coercion, and magnetic without revealing all of herself. In her, ambition and desire merged seamlessly, creating a presence that could match Calder in subtlety, wit, and the quiet assertion of power. Calder's car glided silently through the streets, the unmarked black vehicle a shadow that moved through light with practiced discretion. As the Fontaine St. Clair came into view, it rose like a monolith of elegance, its glass facade reflecting city lights like liquid gold. The building carried an aura of exclusivity. Whispered conversations in the right circles spoke of privacy, discretion, and nights measured by indulgence rather than time. The doorman, trained to anticipate without being obtrusive, acknowledged Calder with the subtle respect reserved for patrons who navigated the world with influence as easily as breathing. The entrance exuded restrained opulence, marble floors, polished metals, and the soft glow of ambient lighting that hinted at indulgence without excess. Every detail suggested that the hotel existed not only to shelter the wealthy, but to choreograph their experiences with precision. Calder moved through the lobby with the calm confidence of someone whose presence was both expected and powerful. The air carried the faint scent of bergamot and polished wood, and the quiet hum of activity hinted at a staff attuned to the rhythms of discretion. This was a place where deals could be discussed, relationships navigated, and indulgences fulfilled, all under the guise of impeccable service and refined privacy. For Calder, the Fontaine St. Clair was more than a hotel. It was a stage designed to serve his desires, a controlled environment where the boundaries between luxury and secrecy merged seamlessly. Every corridor, every suite, and every gesture of staff reinforced the notion that within these walls he was both guest and master of his chosen world. By day, Calder Whitlock was the architect of industry. Meetings, acquisitions, and boardroom negotiations demanded every facet of his intellect and authority. His schedule was a precise machine, each appointment a gear turning seamlessly into the next. Investors and executives moved in step with his decisions, trusting his judgment because it was honed over decade, tempered by experience, and sharpened by a relentless drive to succeed. He commanded markets, influenced trends, and turned potential risks into opportunities that others could scarcely imagine. But night revealed a different Calder, one unbound by the rigid demands of commerce. The carefully constructed persona of the boardroom softened, allowing indulgence and desire to take precedence. Within the controlled privacy of places like the Fontaine St. Clair, he orchestrated encounters that were deliberate, immersive, and sensual. Every detail mattered: lighting that accentuated intimacy, music that guided moods without distraction, and spaces curated to elevate the experience into something almost ceremonial. Felicity Harrow existed at the intersection of these dual lives. She navigated the private side of Calder with the same precision and awareness she brought to every calculated endeavor in her life. Their encounters were not merely physical but strategic, a meeting of two people attuned to the subtle dynamics of influence, attraction, and control. Together they explored indulgence as an art form, a private extension of a world that Calder otherwise commanded with absolute authority. This duality defined him. By day, the city and its markets bent to his will. By night, in suites and private corridors, he explored the architecture of intimacy with a meticulousness that mirrored his business approach. The transition between these worlds was seamless for him, until tonight, when the carefully measured equilibrium of both spheres was about to be disrupted by an unforeseen force that would leave every assumption unsteady. The elevator doors opened to the quiet hush of the 71st floor. A hallway stretched before them, lined with gold accents and deep navy tones, the air faintly scented with sandalwood and champagne. Felicity's hand rested lightly on Calder's arm as they moved towards Suite 71B, their reflections gliding across the polished marble like shadows, perfectly in sync. Inside, the suite was a world of deliberate indulgence. City lights poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow over velvet furnishings and a dining table already prepared with precision, crystal glasses, fine china, and a bottle of vintage champagne resting in a silver bucket. Soft jazz played low in the background, its rhythm unhurried, matching the slow pace of their conversation. Felicity moved with grace, every gesture intentional, her laughter quiet but magnetic. Calder's gaze followed her with a focus that blurred the outside world into irrelevance. Their words were layered with subtlety, casual exchanges masking an undercurrent of unspoken awareness. They didn't need to say everything. The silence between them was articulate enough. As the evening unfolded, their connection deepened, not in grand declarations, but in the rhythm of shared glances, quiet toasts, and the language of familiarity. Felicity traced the rim of her glass with her fingertip, the faint sound a whisper of intent, while Calder leaned forward, his voice lower now, deliberate and steady. The night carried no rush. It was indulgence measured by restraint, and intimacy formed in moments that lingered longer than touch itself. The luxury surrounding them was not for display, but for immersion. Every light, every texture, every reflection in the glass walls seemed to amplify the gravity of their shared secret, a secret contained within the sanctuary of that room, yet heavy enough to shape lives beyond it. The dining room was a cocoon of muted light and quiet sophistication. Candles flickered gently on the table, reflecting off polished silverware and the delicate curves of crystal glasses. Each course arrived with a measured pause, allowing both to savor flavor and anticipation. The first plates carried subtle aromas that teased the senses, truffles, fresh herbs, and the soft sweetness of perfectly ripened fruits. Champagne flowed in delicate streams, bubbles rising like small celebratory whispers. Calder poured with the exacting precision of a man used to controlling outcomes, and Felicity accepted it with a smile that suggested both amusement and acknowledgement of the ritual. They spoke softly, words punctuated by the occasional glance toward the city lights beyond the glass, the metropolis stretching endlessly beneath them. Tension threaded the evening as much as pleasure. Every gesture, every smile carried an awareness of stakes unseen but felt, The weight of secrets, the thrill of shared indulgence, and the knowledge that these moments existed apart from the expectations of the world outside. Even as they laughed lightly, leaned close to whisper, and traced patterns on the polished table, the undercurrent of risk lent a sharpness to the intimacy. The slow pace of dinner allowed observation as much as enjoyment. Calder watched Felicity as she tasted each bite, noting the subtleties in her expressions, the way her eyes caught the candlelight, the faint arch of her brow that suggested calculation intertwined with desire. Felicity, in turn, read the flicker of emotion across Calder's face, appreciating the balance between the man who ruled empires and the man who sought the private indulgence of the night. By the time the dessert was served, delicate confections paired with liqueurs, the room had become a world entirely their own. The city continued below, indifferent, glittering and alive, while inside the suite, each moment was amplified, every sigh, glance, and soft laugh woven into the rhythm of a carefully curated evening of indulgence and subtle tension. Within the quiet luxury of Suite 71B, the exchange between Calder and Felicity extended beyond mere physicality. It was an intricate negotiation of presence, attention, and control. Each movement was measured, each glance deliberate. Power and desire were not opposites here. They were intertwined, weaving through the soft light, the music, and the silence between sentences. Calder, accustomed to influence in the boardroom, found it mirrored in subtle domestic gestures. The curve of Felicity's smile, the lift of her hand to a glass, the pause in her laughter, each was a calibration he absorbed with precision. His desire was not only for pleasure, but for the affirmation of being seen, understood, and desired in return, in a space free from the scrutiny of the city below. Felicity, equally aware of the dynamics, navigated the tension with mastery. She knew the allure of scarcity, the magnetism of restraint, and the power of anticipation. Her presence was both indulgent and exacting, offering intimacy on her terms while maintaining a psychological equilibrium that left Calder simultaneously exhilarated and contained. The room itself became a participant in their negotiation. Light softened edges, shadows shifted to conceal or reveal, and the very arrangement of furniture allowed calculated proximity. Every gesture, a touch of a shoulder, a whisper, a glance, carried weight beyond its apparent simplicity. The psychological landscape was complex, desire fueled by discretion, indulgence informed by power, and the thrill of shared secrets amplifying their connection. In these moments, Calder experienced both surrender and command. The man who dictated market trends found his authority limited to the subtler measures of consent and engagement. Felicity, meanwhile, commanded with subtlety, shaping the course of their encounter through wit, poise, and the quiet assertion of control. In the balance of give and take, of indulgence and awareness, the affair became less a matter of chance and more an intricate choreography of influence and desire. Beyond the curated intimacy of Suite 71B, another presence quietly governed the space, Seraphine Whitlock. While Calder and Felicity engaged in their deliberate rituals of indulgence, Seraphine moved through the hotel corridors with an efficiency and calm that left no corner unattended. Her authority was quiet, unobtrusive, yet absolute. Every staff member knew instinctively which requests required immediate attention and which moments could remain untouched. Her ownership was less about spectacle and more about control rendered with subtlety. The Fontaine St. Clair, to the casual observer, was simply an emblem of luxury. To Seraphine, it was a living entity, a structure of opportunities, events, and responsibilities carefully aligned with her vision. Rooms were prepared with her standards in mind, appointments scheduled with foresight, and every detail reflected her influence, even when she was unseen. The hotel's grandeur existed not solely for guests, but as a manifestation of her capability to manage a world far beyond the reach of the city's gaze. The contrast could not have been starker. In the dim warmth of the suite, Calder wielded charm and indulgence like instruments of mastery, unaware that the broader stage remained firmly under Seraphine's guidance. Her presence was felt in the smooth operation of staff, in the precision of every prepared space, and in the invisible architecture that allowed indulgence to take place under her silent watch. She needed no confrontation, no drama. Her authority was inherent, effective, and inescapable. This juxtaposition heightened the stakes. Calder's confidence, built on a life of public domination and private indulgence, faced an undercurrent of power he had never directly confronted. Felicity's awareness and allure, compelling as they were, could not override the subtle influence Seraphine exerted over the environment, a reminder that the world Calder navigated, even in secret, was never entirely his to command. Seraphine's quiet strength was a foil to the heated, indulgent intimacy, unfolding just floors above the city streets. While Calder and Felicity indulged in desire and power, the unseen architect of the hotel's reality maintained a presence that was commanding without effort, formidable without overt action. It was a silent assertion. Influence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it shapes outcomes long before anyone realizes the game has begun. As the evening unfolded, the camera of imagination lingers over the intimate yet calculated interaction between Calder and Felicity. They leaned closer, voices lowered to soft confessions and playful remarks, the world outside forgotten. Every movement carried precision, desire, and a keen awareness of the stakes, a delicate dance performed under the cloak of luxury and secrecy. At this juncture, dear viewer, one must pause and reflect. Consider yourself in Calder's position, commanding in public, indulgent in private, yet unaware of forces quietly shaping the environment around you. What choices would you make? Would you allow desire to dictate decisions, or would discretion guide every step? Could you navigate indulgence without losing sight of the unseen power influencing your surroundings? Even as Calder and Felicity traced the contours of their connection, Seraphine's presence loomed quietly, her influence implicit yet undeniable. The tension between indulgence and restraint, secrecy and authority, becomes more pronounced, and the question emerges for anyone observing from the margins. How does one balance personal desire with the gravity of consequences beyond immediate perception? Consider your response. Reflect on the power of quiet authority versus the allure of overt indulgence. Engage with the story. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Calder's position. Could you maintain control in a world layered with secrecy, sophistication, and hidden oversight? The story is yours to interpret, and your perspective adds dimension to the unfolding narrative. By pondering these questions, the evening's luxury, charm, and subtle psychological tension extend beyond the suite itself, inviting viewers to explore the consequences of choices made in private spaces, under the guise of controlled indulgence, yet in the presence of authority that remains unseen. The soft click of a door handle echoed through the hallway, barely audible above the distant hum of the city below. Seraphine's presence was deliberate yet unannounced, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to spaces bending to her will without notice. She carried nothing but a quiet authority, her posture straight, her steps measured, leaving an invisible trace of command in the air behind her. As the door to Suite 71B swung open, the glow from the city framed her silhouette, a calm contrast to the intimate warmth inside. The suite, meticulously arranged for indulgence, suddenly held an unexpected observer. Calder and Felicity, immersed in each other's company, paused mid-motion. Words, gestures, and even the music seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself sensed the shift. Seraphine's eyes swept across the scene with precision, not for spectacle but for observation. Every detail, the tilt of a glass, the alignment of cutlery, the subtle tension in Calder's expression, was catalogued effortlessly. The room was no longer simply a space of private indulgence. It had become a stage on which consequences were quietly revealed. Calder, frozen mid-gesture, felt the first pangs of recognition. This intrusion was not accidental. Felicity's hand stilled at her side, the awareness of being caught in someone else's orbit pressing against the curated rhythm of the evening. The unexpected arrival introduced a stillness so charged that even the faintest breath seemed amplified, echoing in the quiet corners of the suite. In that single motion of entry, Seraphine shifted the balance of power. She carried no threat in the form of words or action. Instead, her presence alone, composed and deliberate, unsettled the carefully constructed world Calder believed he controlled. The suite, designed for privacy, now bore witness to authority that had been silently omnipresent all along. Time seemed to stretch inside the suite, each second drawn out like the quiet reverberation of a note held too long. Calder froze where he stood, the glass in his hand trembling just slightly, as though the city's light outside had punctured the illusion of control he had carefully maintained. Felicity's breath caught, the subtle movement of her shoulders betraying an awareness of stakes far larger than her own desires. Seraphine's presence did not demand attention. It claimed it naturally. She did not raise her voice, did not gesture, and yet the energy in the room pivoted sharply. Eyes met briefly, Calder's wide with surprise, Felicity's registering a mix of calculation and restraint, and then moved to Seraphine, whose calm expression offered no condemnation, only the quiet assertion of understanding what had transpired. The city beyond the glass carried on, indifferent to the sudden stillness, as if acknowledging that some dramas played out in silence rather than spectacle. The suite itself seemed to hold its breath, the music's gentle strings suspended in midair, shadows lingering longer than they had moment before. Every object, every detail of the carefully curated environment now felt part of the tension, a witness to the intersection of indulgence and authority. Calder felt the gravity of the moment pressing against him, not with force but with inevitability. Felicity, for all her experience and composure, recognized that she was now a participant in a tableau larger than herself, where private desire collided with a presence that could not be negotiated or deferred. The room, frozen in the cinematic pause, became a mirror of choices, consequences, and unspoken dynamics, each layer observed in the hush of anticipation. This moment did not require drama through sound or conflict. Its power lay in stillness, the precise arrangement of figures, the subtle tension in posture and gaze, the interplay of light and shadow that held the suite captive. Every second extended the suspense, a slow revelation of the reality Calder had underestimated and the quiet authority Seraphine had always wielded, even from the periphery. The sudden intrusion had shifted the axis of the evening, forcing Calder to confront truths he had long deferred. In that suspended moment, he saw the meticulously constructed duality of his life laid bare, the polished veneer of success and power, and the indulgent spaces where desire had once felt absolute. Now, both facets collided under Seraphine's unyielding presence, leaving him exposed in ways numbers, contracts, and negotiations had never allowed. Felicity, attuned to the nuances of social and emotional maneuvering, perceived the fragility in Calder's carefully maintained control. The realization came quietly, almost imperceptibly. No matter how precise or deliberate her involvement had been, she was secondary in the hierarchy of influence that governed his world. She had been invited into a private orbit, but the true center, Seraphine, remained untouchable, quietly asserting ownership of both space and circumstance. For Calder, the weight of the consequences was immediate and internal. Each indulgent choice, every compartmentalized evening, each moment of secrecy unfolded in the clarity of this single unannounced presence. The ledger of private life and public image, once abstract, now pressed against him with the reality of human observation and authority. His control over space, affection, and discretion proved more fragile than anticipated, vulnerable to quiet, deliberate assertion from someone whose power did not need to announce itself. Felicity, understanding her temporary position, adjusted instinctively. She withdrew slightly, her composure intact, but the subtle recognition of hierarchy, of Seraphine's unspoken dominance, reframed the evening. Calder's glance toward her carried a mix of apology and helpless calculation. the weight of the realization pressing like gravity across the space they had once moved through freely. The collision of indulgence and authority, desire and consequence, left the suite heavy with a quiet reckoning. No words were immediately necessary. Awareness alone reshaped the dynamics, realigning positions in a hierarchy that Calder had thought he controlled. In the subtle shift, both he and Felicity grasped the full extent of the private power that had always existed, now illuminated with precision and inevitability. The suite, once a stage for indulgence and carefully orchestrated intimacy, had transformed into a theater of unspoken authority. Seraphine stood with the calm precision of someone who understood influence without performing it. Her gaze, steady and measured, conveyed judgment not through anger but through clarity. Each line of her posture, each pause in her movement, radiated a quiet dominance that contrasted sharply with Calder's sudden vulnerability. Calder, accustomed to commanding attention and directing outcomes, felt the weight of power shift. The control he relied upon in boardrooms and private encounters seemed to dissolve. His shock was not marked by outbursts, but by the subtle tremor of realization, the recognition that authority did not always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it existed simply in presence and perception. Felicity, observing from a careful distance, noted the contrast. The man who usually held the room, the woman, and even circumstance itself in the palm of his hand was now constrained by the unspoken assertion of Seraphine's ownership. The intricate balance of desire and power that Calder had cultivated now tilted in Seraphine's favor. Her authority was neither loud nor performative. It was structural, built into every aspect of the space and moment. In that quiet dynamic, the suite became a crucible. Every object, every measured step, every glance magnified the disparity between the two forces. Calder's usually confident movements slowed, constrained by the awareness of an authority he had overlooked. Seraphine's composure, by contrast, required no energy. It was self-sustaining, effortless, and unmistakably absolute. This moment crystallized the essence of power. It did not need to shout to dominate, nor did it require the validation of spectacle. Its presence was enough. Calder's shock, subtle yet profound, underscored the shift, illuminating the invisible hierarchies that had always existed but were now unavoidable. The suite, suffused with soft city light and restrained opulence, bore witness to a truth Calder had never truly accounted for. Quiet authority, when exercised with precision, leaves the boldest personalities unarmed. The suite held its breath. Time seemed to stretch, each second deliberately extended as if to underscore the unspoken consequences that now hung in the room. Calder's movements, once confident and assured, were cautious, hesitant, every glance toward Seraphine measured, calculated, searching for an opening that did not exist. The rhythm of the evening, the music, the subtle clink of glassware, the city's distant murmur, all slowed, each sound magnified by the weight of tension. Felicity, caught between desire and self-preservation, felt the subtle gravity of the moment. The carefully constructed intimacy she had counted on was no longer absolute. Every gesture, every shift of posture became a negotiation in silence. She realized the space they occupied had been quietly claimed by a force neither passion nor persuasion could override. Seraphine moved slowly, each step precise and deliberate, emphasizing her command without the need for confrontation. She approached the suite as if it were a chessboard, and she had already anticipated every move, yet her presence alone was sufficient to tip the balance. Calder's shock deepened with the realization that the control he had once wielded so effortlessly had no purchase here. The luxurious surroundings, designed for indulgence and seduction, now served as a stage for restraint, observation, and the quiet assertion of authority. The suspense was in the silence, the weight of expectation, the unspoken evaluation of choices, the pause before words could find their place. The room itself seemed to participate, each element, the furniture, the lighting, the cityscape beyond, prolonging the anticipation, reinforcing the stakes without a single uttered accusation. In this slow, deliberate unfolding, The audience feels the tension as deeply as the characters do. The drama is not explosive. It is surgical, refined, and psychologically immersive. Every second stretches perception, heightening awareness of what is at risk, reputations, desires, relationships, and the fragile constructions of private indulgence. Calder's internal turmoil mirrors the viewer's own curiosity and dread, while Seraphine's composed presence amplifies the inevitable reckoning. The scene closes on this prolonged, deliberate suspense, a moment that lingers in the mind, emphasizing drama without spectacle, leaving both characters and audience acutely aware of the invisible lines that have been crossed. The city beyond the fontaine seemed both familiar and unrecognizable as Felicity stepped into the waiting car. Her departure was quiet, deliberate. No fanfare, no confrontation, only the soft closing of the door and the faint hum of the engine. Calder watched from the suite window, the pulse of the skyline now echoing the unsettled rhythm within himself. The luxury that had framed the night felt suddenly hollow. A stage emptied of the performance he had believed was under his control. Alone, Calder felt the private weight of exposure pressing against him. Shame was not a spectacle here. It was intimate and internal, a recognition of miscalculations, of the indulgences that had been permitted to exist without consequence. Until now, every luxury, every meticulously curated indulgence had been reframed by the quiet intrusion. The bed, the champagne, the music that had accompanied seduction and calculation now resonated differently. They became markers of a life that had been compartmentalized into neat, private sections, each section now compromised. His mind raced, not with strategy for the office, but with the fragile arithmetic of trust, discretion, and intimacy. Calder, who had spent years wielding influence effortlessly, found the familiar metrics of success insufficient. He could no longer rely on the usual parameters of authority or wealth to buffer against the reality of exposure. Each reflection of himself in the polished glass surfaces of the suite carried the same unflinching observation, a man confronted by his own misjudgment. Felicity, meanwhile, moved toward independence with a composed decisiveness. The city's pulse accompanied her journey away, and Calder's gaze lingered until the tail lights dissolved into the night. He understood, with the slow, inevitable clarity of consequence, that the indulgences of the past hours were irrevocable. The evening had altered more than circumstance. It had shifted perception, both his own and the relationships that had defined the private architecture of his life. The silence left in her absence was heavy, yet strangely instructive. Calder, usually accustomed to manipulating environment and expectation, discovered that the calculus of personal choice and consequence could not be negotiated with charm or resources. He was left with a private reckoning, a solitude shaped not by solitude itself, but by the weight of choices now revealed, and consequences unavoidable. The next morning, Calder found Seraphine waiting in their townhouse's conservatory. Sunlight filtered gently through the glass panes, illuminating orchids and ferns that had once been mere decoration, but now seemed to witness the negotiation of lives. She did not rush, did not dramatize. Every movement was measured, precise, a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos Calder had carried through the night. "Calder," she said, her voice steady, devoid of reproach yet charged with authority. "We need to speak about the terms of our future." Her choice of words carried the weight of deliberate consideration. There was no threat, no outburst, only clarity. Every syllable framed the inevitable, separation but on her terms. Calder, whose life had been a succession of calculated maneuvers, felt the familiar tools of persuasion falter. Money, charm, influence, none provided leverage here. Seraphine's calm, deliberate approach dismantled the habitual advantages he had relied upon. The very stillness of her presence was a declaration of control, a quiet assertion that this conversation was governed by principle, not spectacle. She outlined the steps with exacting care, a shared statement to protect their public image, agreements regarding household management, and a plan for their philanthropic and social commitments. Her demeanor conveyed both generosity and firmness. There was no malice, only the unwavering focus of someone reclaiming agency over the spaces and decisions that mattered most. Calder listened, absorbing the full scope of her control. He recognized that his usual confidence, built on dominance in business and social influence, was inadequate here. The quiet authority she wielded was not born of confrontation but of clarity and deliberate intent. Each phrase, each pause, reinforced the truth. The equilibrium of their life together had shifted irrevocably, and he was now navigating unfamiliar territory. Seraphine concluded with a kind of composed certainty that left no room for argument. "We will proceed with separation, Calder, civil, structured, and deliberate." In that measured statement lay the full power of her assertion. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded spectacle, yet every word marked the redefinition of their lives, the recalibration of control, and the ultimate reminder that presence and poise could outweigh any previous advantage. Calder Whitlock's office, once his arena of mastery, now felt different. The panoramic view of the skyline that had always signified achievement seemed distant, as if separated from him by an invisible barrier. The calls, the meetings, the strategic negotiations all continued, but with an unfamiliar weight pressing beneath the surface. He was performing his role, but the rhythm that had once come effortlessly now required effort. Behind the polished confidence he projected, Calder was wrestling with dissonance. His influence remained, his empire intact, yet his internal compass had shifted. The events at the Fontaine St. Clair had not dismantled his empire. They had exposed its fragility. He found himself revisiting decisions with uncharacteristic hesitation, second-guessing instincts that had once felt unerring. The media knew nothing, yet silence carried its own form of exposure. Whispers circulated among his board members, not about scandal, but about distraction, fatigue, and a perceptible shift in focus. Calder's signature precision had dulled. He was still respected, still envied, but quietly questioned. The control he once wielded with ease now seemed to resist him, slipping through the cracks of composure he struggled to maintain. Felicity, in contrast, moved through her own transformation. No longer defined by secrecy, she began reconstructing a sense of self that existed beyond indulgence. She returned to her former profession, interior architecture, but with renewed clarity. The experience had stripped away illusions she hadn't realized she had built. There was no bitterness in her rebuilding, only an acknowledgement of lessons absorbed in silence. Her projects reflected this evolution, structured, confident, elegant in restraint. While Calder fought to maintain the facade of continuity, Felicity found liberation in separation. She no longer existed in the margins of someone else's decisions. For the first time in years, her narrative was self-directed, guided not by desire or dependency, but by autonomy. Their trajectories ran parallel but opposite. Calder's struggle was quiet and internal, the erosion of certainty within a man accustomed to command. Felicity's ascent was steady and external, the rebuilding of confidence within a woman who had learned the value of self-definition. Both moved forward, yet their paths would never again converge. The contrast between them became the unspoken truth of consequence, one learning humility through loss of control, the other reclaiming strength through release. In the weeks that followed, the Whitlock household carried a quiet tension, a stillness that spoke louder than words. Rooms once filled with coordinated motion and conversation now seemed suspended in time. Calder moved through them like a man visiting old landmarks, each one a reminder of routines that had been upended. His identity, once fortified by power and command, felt vulnerable under the scrutiny of private reflection. He walked through the expansive halls of his residence, tracing the edges of spaces that had once been familiar. The study, with its rows of leather-bound ledgers, now seemed intimidatingly empty. The dining room, where orchestrated interactions had once cemented his public image, was silent, the chairs waiting without expectation. Calder felt the weight of introspection pressing against him, a mirror held up to choices he could neither erase nor ignore. Emotional distance settled in quietly, like a fog that refuses to lift. Felicity's absence and Seraphine's deliberate detachment carved spaces that Calder could not reclaim. The intimacy that had once seemed under his control now existed beyond reach, and with it went certainty. Regret surfaced not as dramatic lamentation, but as subtle ache, the recognition of moments and decisions irreversibly altered by his own indulgence. Simultaneously, Felicity navigated her life with steady steps. Her independence became both shield and compass. She faced her own reflections, the desires that had led her into the fontaine, the choices she had made within the intricate web of Calder's life, and acknowledged them with clarity. Her days were filled with creative work, meetings with clients, and small deliberate joys that grounded her in the reality she had reclaimed. The emotional fallout extended beyond immediate relationships. Calder discovered that influence could not always compensate for the erosion of personal bonds. Felicity found that self-possession demanded discipline and acceptance. Both experienced the quiet ache of consequences. Calder through the subtle diminishment of confidence and perceived control. Felicity through the responsibility of autonomy. In this period, silence became a language. Words were weighed, gestures measured, and interactions carefully curated. No grand reconciliations were sought, no dramatic confrontations erupted. Instead, each private choice, each step forward or backward, carried the weight of their shared history. The intimate knowledge of errors, indulgences, and the slow recalibration of identity. As the camera lingers on the soft morning light filtering through the Whitlock residence, the city beyond begins to hum with life once more. Calder's silhouette stands by the window, reflective, almost fragile in contrast to the empire he commands. Felicity's studio, distant but vibrant, hums with creative energy, her independence unmistakable. Seraphine, composed and assured, moves through spaces reclaimed as her own. And here, dear viewers, we pause to ask something important. What would you have done if faced with the quiet collapse of control, the sudden exposure of indulgence, or the need to reclaim independence after being caught in someone else's orbit? Take a moment to consider pride, love, and consequence. How do you navigate moments when personal choices ripple beyond expectation, when secrecy collides with reality, and the architecture of relationships is tested? What would guide your decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, your reflections, experiences, or even quiet observations. Have you ever had to face a private reckoning that reshaped how you saw yourself or others? If this story has captured your attention, please hit like, share it with someone who appreciates intricate human dynamics, and subscribe for more tales that explore the intersections of ambition, desire, and consequence. Your engagement keeps this storytelling alive and allows us to continue bringing these intimate, captivating narratives to life. Remember, the choices made in silence can echo louder than the loudest declarations. We invite you to reflect, to respond, and to immerse yourself in the subtleties of human connection. The morning sun cast a quiet glow over the Fontaine St. Clair, softening the steel and glass into gentle warmth. Inside, Seraphine Whitlock sat at a long mahogany table, papers meticulously arranged before her. Each document represented more than legal ownership. It was a deliberate act of redefining what had been a private playground into a space of purpose. With a steady hand, she signed the final transfer of the hotel's title into the foundation she oversaw. The gesture was decisive yet calm, executed without fanfare. Staff moved around her with the unspoken respect reserved for someone who commanded authority without needing to announce it. There was no ceremony, no display of triumph, just the quiet assertion of control, a reallocation of power toward intention rather than indulgence. For Seraphine, this was an act of autonomy as much as strategy. The Fontaine, once a backdrop for Calder's carefully curated indulgences, now belonged to something larger than desire or personal ego. It would host art exhibitions, philanthropy events, and cultural programming under her direction, extending influence into spaces she valued most. Each initiative reinforced her presence as a figure who wielded power with precision and principle. Calder, when he learned of the transfer, felt a mixture of disbelief and a subtle displacement. Ownership had been one of his last anchors, a tangible sign of his ability to direct outcomes in a world he assumed remained predictable under his hand. Seraphine had redefined the terms. Quietly, efficiently, and irrevocably, the hotel, still glittering in the city skyline, had shifted its identity. No longer a personal stage for secret indulgences, it now operated on a frequency Calder could not influence. The act itself was unremarkable in appearance, but monumental in consequence, a declaration that the architecture of control and intimacy had changed, leaving him to navigate a reality he could no longer command. Lucien Voss moved through the Fontaine St. Clair with a quiet authority that demanded no applause. He was a curator by nature, someone who understood spaces, people, and timing in ways Calder never had. Tall, composed, and meticulous, Lucien possessed a presence that blended seamlessly into luxury while asserting its own understated command. Seraphine observed him with a mix of approval and relief. His calm energy balanced the intensity of the hotel's operations and complemented her strategic vision. Where Calder had treated spaces as extensions of his will, Lucien approached them as instruments, delicate, nuanced, requiring finesse rather than force. He navigated staff, guests, and events with the precision of someone who anticipated outcomes without dictating them, and yet never interfered unnecessarily. For the first time in months, Seraphine felt the hotel's pulse align with her intentions instead of Calder's indulgences. Lucien managed interactions with elegance, ensuring every event reflected her values while maintaining the discretion that high-profile patrons expected. His presence brought reassurance, a steady rhythm that replaced the unpredictability she had grown weary of. Lucien's influence extended subtly into Seraphine's personal life as well. He was not an intruder nor a replacement. He was a collaborator. In private moments, Seraphine found she could trust him with vision and detail, and his judgment often allowed her to step back and observe the broader consequences of her decisions. Where Calder had relied on spectacle, Lucien relied on alignment, with people, processes, and the purpose behind each action. Even Calder, who occasionally crossed paths with the Fontaine for work or social events, recognized Lucien's quiet impact. There was no need for confrontation. Lucien simply existed in a space Calder once assumed he could dominate, and the shift was undeniable. The hotel was no longer a stage for indulgence, but a stage for deliberate action, and Lucien's presence ensured it would remain so. Calder Whitlock, accustomed to orchestrating outcomes with precision, felt an unfamiliar tension as he approached the Fontaine St. Clair in the weeks following Seraphine's transfer. The building still gleamed under the city lights, yet the air inside now carried a rhythm he could no longer dictate. Each hallway, each private dining room, no longer seemed to defer to his presence. He attempted subtle interventions first, requests for access to events, invitations to meet staff, suggestions about programming. Each effort was polite on the surface but carried the weight of expectation, a test of whether his old influence still held sway. Yet the responses he received were measured and deliberate, respectful but not pliable. The language of authority he had once mastered now felt blunt, like a key no longer fitting a lock. Meetings with Lucien Voss revealed the extent of the shift. Lucien's calm explanations and strategic oversight demonstrated that Seraphine's vision had been carefully implemented, and Calder's input, while noted, could not alter the flow. Lucien never challenged him directly, yet every decision, every planning document, subtly reflected Seraphine's priorities and a structure that excluded Calder's habitual interventions. The realization struck gradually, and then with clarity, control had moved. Where Calder had once measured influence in immediacy, Seraphine measured it in enduring outcomes. The Fontaine's events ran smoothly, patron satisfaction remained high, and Seraphine's presence ensured discretion without spectacle. The empire he assumed he could manipulate now operated independently of him, and the power he relied upon to navigate both social and private spheres had diminished quietly but irreversibly. Even within Calder, a strange mixture of frustration and admiration arose. He recognized the skill required to wield influence without resorting to force. Yet, he could not suppress the sting of displacement. The hotel, once his playground of indulgence, was no longer a stage for him to act upon desire. It was a testament to Seraphine's capability, her foresight, and her ability to reclaim spaces he had taken for granted. As he left the Fontaine after another meeting with Lucien, Calder understood the truth. Influence, like intimacy, could not be commanded solely by past reputation or wealth. It required presence, alignment, and trust, qualities Seraphine had cultivated while he had assumed ownership granted him dominion. The shift was complete, and for the first time, Calder had to confront life from a position of recalibrated expectation rather than entitlement. Seraphine moved through her life with a grace that had nothing to prove. The Fontaine St. Clair now pulsed with her vision, art exhibits, cultural events, and intimate gatherings that reflected her taste, intellect, and values. She navigated the social landscape with quiet confidence, commanding attention without demanding it. Each decision reinforced her independence, and the subtle authority she exercised reminded Calder that her strength had always existed, simply dormant, under the weight of expectation. Calder, in contrast, confronted his absence from that center of control with a mixture of fascination and unease. He realized that his influence, once seemingly absolute, now operated at the periphery. Social events where he had previously dictated tone now unfolded under Seraphine's guidance. Patrons and associates greeted him politely, but it was clear their allegiance had shifted. They followed her lead, not his. Each encounter reminded him that legacy and power could be curated without his direct intervention. Felicity, too, adapted. The life she had intertwined with Calder's secret world had to be recalibrated. She reclaimed autonomy, focusing on her career, cultivating relationships on her own terms, and discovering spaces where desire and ambition were no longer framed by someone else's decisions. Her experience with Calder became a quiet reference point, a chapter she could close with elegance, leaving no unnecessary drama in its wake. The dynamic between the three had changed fundamentally. Calder's attempts to assert dominance met a wall of calm resilience. Seraphine's presence reminded him that influence is inseparable from integrity and foresight, while Felicity's autonomy reflected a world moving forward without reliance on his indulgence. The city continued to hum with energy, yet within these private intersections of life, the subtle recalibration of relationships underscored the consequences of choices made in the past. Seraphine's flourishing was not loud, it was deliberate, disciplined, and unyielding. Her name became synonymous with vision and refined judgment. Calder and Felicity, observing from their own respective angles, began to understand that life had offered a new geography, one in which they existed but no longer dominated, the map. Each found a way to navigate the terrain, learning to operate with clarity, awareness, and a measure of respect for spaces they once assumed were theirs to command. As the city settled into night, Calder stood outside the Fontaine St. Clair, watching the lights ripple across its glass facade. Each window carried a story, a choice, a life moving in ways he no longer dictated. He felt the weight of absence, not in loud confrontation, but in the quiet, reshaping of a world he had assumed he controlled. The hotel was still magnificent, still radiant, yet it no longer responded to his presence. Seraphine moved through her life with measured steps, each decision a testament to autonomy. She laughed at events not for appearance, but for genuine delight. Her interactions were free from expectation, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and in that calm, she reclaimed a narrative Calder had believed he authored. Ownership, she demonstrated, was more than possession. It was stewardship, vision, and restraint. Felicity, meanwhile, walked a path of her own making. Freed from the clandestine intersections with Calder, she discovered spaces where desire and ambition coexisted without complication. Her independence was quiet but complete, a subtle assertion of choice and self-respect that contrasted sharply with the indulgences of her past. She encountered Calder occasionally, and in those meetings civility reigned, No blame, no theatrics, only a shared acknowledgement that life had redirected them. The story of Calder, Seraphine, and Felicity was now an intricate rhythm of presence and absence. Power had shifted, choices had consequences, and yet the narrative remained unresolved, leaving room for interpretation. Some outcomes were stark, others were gentle, barely perceptible. Each character discovered a version of themselves previously obscured, and the audience was left to consider the questions posed by their journeys. What is ownership? What is influence? How do choices, indulgence, and discretion intersect to shape life? In the quiet of night, the fontaine shimmered like a monument to transformation rather than conquest. Calder understood that control could not simply be reclaimed. Felicity recognized her freedom, and Seraphine confirmed her sovereignty over a domain she had quietly mastered. The resolution was neither dramatic nor complete. It was subtle, layered, and open. Each life had been altered, each presence recalibrated, yet none were diminished entirely. And so, the story concluded not with a definitive lesson, but with questions hovering in the air, inviting reflection. The audience, like Calder and Felicity, would consider the nuances of choice, desire, and consequence. Was it justice? Was it freedom? Or simply the natural unfolding of lives intertwined and then redirected? The answers remained as individual as the viewers themselves, leaving a lasting echo of ambiguity in thought. CTA 4th, justice or freedom? What's your take? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories from Mr. Williams Storytime.